like to move into our next panel session, and we would ask for General William Kip Ward and Colonel Pena to please join us.
You know, it's quieter in here right now, but we're ready to do something than it was before. This is great.
Ladies and gentlemen, I can go on and on reading the accolades of these two gentlemen. General William Kip Ward, first commanding general for AFRICOM for the United States of America, and Colonel Pena, who has operated at the highest levels of the Defense Department, served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary, and for many years provided his expertise in that particular area to Latin America and the Caribbean. And we are grateful to have two distinguished military officers, flag officers, here with us this afternoon. Let's please have another round of applause for their service. I would like each of you, and we'll start with Colonel Pena, to just take a moment and just talk a little about your experience working with the Defense Department, working throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, and then we'll circle back with questions, and then we'll ask the same of General Ward, your experience, your command, setting up and establishing Africa Command for the first time for the United States of America. Run us through a little bit of that, sir, and then we'll go into a robust Q&A. So Colonel Pena, please.
Well, thank you all very much. First of all, I want to thank the organizers, and it's a real privilege for me to be here to speak to all of you, especially in such a beautiful place. I'm an immigrant from Mexico. I came to this country not speaking a word of English, and in one generation I've been able to achieve the status of a taxpayer, so it's a real blessing to be here. So if I took up the English, please excuse me. I'm still working at it. I wanted to start by giving you a sort of a boilerplate of what it is to develop policy. Having spent 30 years in the Army, and in my specialty as a foreign area officer, I had already been working in the hemisphere for a bit, but working at the highest levels of the Pentagon really gave me an appreciation for how you develop strategy. The first thing I thought about is, how do we defend this hemisphere? Because this is the quintessential hemisphere, because it contains the United States, and I'm one of those guys that says, if my job is to protect the United States, let's start there. So the way that we protect the United States is, first we do a threat assessment. And threat assessments, you start with what can cause you the most damage, and then you work your way down from there. What can cause the most damage is a global nuclear war. That's at the height of the spectrum. And when we were looking at the Western Hemisphere, we also had NORAD. So NORAD was a consideration because we had to be concerned about any kind of an attack on the United States from anywhere. And so from that, I then looked at what's next. You have state-on-state violence. It could be global or not global. Look at what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. That's what that looks like. And then from there, you went to state within a state violence, civil wars. And then beyond that, you went into terrorism, and then you went to drug trafficking organizations. And in this hemisphere, we have to be concerned about nature, because nature always has a way of making a mess of things, as we're seeing right now with Hurricane Fiona that's ravishing the Caribbean. So these are the kinds of things that we have to take into consideration. And we have to look at those threats within all domains. By all domains, I mean land, sea, air, space, and cyber. Within cyber, you have artificial intelligence, and all these other areas that are starting to make things a little bit more complex, because when you get into the cyber domain, it affects all the others. So what does that have to do with the rest of our partners? Well, if you're going to defend this hemisphere, you want to do it as a neighborhood, as a family. And in this neighborhood, one of the benefits we have of living in this hemisphere is that it's collaborative, it's relatively prosperous, and it's secure. But we do have significant challenges, and those challenges come from terrorism, they come from drug trafficking organizations, they come from mass migration, and then they come from the environment. And by the way, within nature, you also include pandemics, because we had already been through one back in the early 2000s in Mexico. Well, I'm sorry, that was 2007. That was so late. So those are the kinds of things that you have to work with the partners. And when you work at coming up with solutions for how you confront those threats, you want to be able to meet your partners halfway, because everybody has a unique quality. And this is when you get into this whole issue of relationships and the importance of relationships and how you face these threats. So the more that you can have a collaborative environment with your partners, the better off you're going to be. And you've got to look at things that are relevant to defense. You know, we look at the pillars of power, which are diplomatic, information, military, and economic. The military is a hammer. That's the last one you pull out, because you want to be able to exhaust the other ones, so that you have a more collaborative approach to how you create this defense environment. And what you want to do is look at things that are focused on defense. There are certain temptations to want to get out of your reservation and start looking at things that really don't have that much to do with defense. We, in the time that I was in my job, focused strictly on defense. So those things that cause problems based on that paradigm I've just shown you is what we focused on. So I'd rather just get into the questions and answers, and we can get into the specifics of how that impacts this hemisphere now. Sure.
Well, I appreciate that, because what he just finished talking about were the things that I implemented across my 40-plus year wearing the cloth foundation. As a United States Army officer serving for those 40 years, but I've been retired now for over a decade, so you have some idea of my vintage, if you will. It was my job to be the implementer of the defense policy that was established by the United States of America. As I became more senior, it became very apparent to me that defense policy was intertwined within all other aspects of our governmental activities and businesses. And I developed that understanding through operational assignments around the globe, having served in Alaska, Hawaii, Europe, Asia, Africa. My experiences as a commander at echelon, from commanding as few as 35 soldiers to commanding as many as 30,000 soldiers, showed me that when it comes to how people view their security wherever they are around the world, it's the same as how Kip Ward viewed his security growing up outside of Baltimore, Maryland. I wanted to be able to go to school. I wanted to be able to be relatively healthy. I wanted to eat. I wanted to be able to go out and not get too concerned about someone snatching me up in the middle of the night. And those types of concerns are evident and real around the world. The point was made a bit ago with respect to one of the ministers, maybe the head of state, that our DNA is essentially the same. We want what we want, and those things are not unlike what others want as well. Having served as a NATO commander in the Balkans, having served as the United States Security Coordinator to Israel and the Palestinian Authority, having been, even though I'm an Army officer, having served in multiple joint assignments, to include being in the Pentagon on 9/11 and not leaving that building for 5 days during the events that transpired subsequent to then. But also having served as a commander of a division in the Asia Pacific Theater, and then during my later stages of my career, serving as first as the Deputy Commander of the United States European Command, a joint command, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, Coast Guard, and as a point of having the distinct honor and pleasure of being our nation's first commander of the United States Africa Command and standing up that command. Importantly there, all of those other things I had experienced came home to roost. Working with our interagency partners across our government, from our cabinet level departments to all of our agencies, how we understood the work being done by Commerce Department, Agriculture Department, State Department, United States Agency for International Development, our three-letter agencies. All of those activities resident inside of AFRICOM. Not that we did that work, but the importance of it so that there was a synchronized, cohesive approach to what we were doing, so that, as we said in the days of forming AFRICOM, we add value and do no harm. Again, addressing that thing that I said at the beginning, what is important to citizens of various countries around the world. And I had the ability to do that working with my African partners and friends for about 5 years. First as the Deputy Commander in European Command, and then as the Commander of Africa Command. And as I traveled the continent of Africa, having, in my days, there were 53 countries to include the Indian Ocean Island nations, as I was often reminded by my heads of state from the Indian Ocean Island nations, as well as the things that we were doing to help secure a peaceful global commons. Not that it was our job to do that for our friends, but it was a part of our interest to do our best to support the activities of our friends to secure their own borders and to do things that were important to them. And we did that in a way through relationships. I was so appreciative of the remarks made by our recipients just receiving the awards. It was a pleasure. I appreciate, Madam, your support for what you do, because truly how soldiers are treated, and we'll get to this, is such an important component of how effective they will be in peace and security operations. My mother used to, before she passed away, she said, if I wasn't a soldier, I could have been a teacher because I like to talk. And I tell stories, but I tell stories based on things that I've experienced and seen. And the consistency of those things that I see, again, globally. What I saw in Africa was, for my very first time in Africa in 1992, as a full colonel, as I went to Somalia, was no different than what I saw from the standpoint of the impact on people than what I saw in Bosnia when I was there, when I saw in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank of Israel when I was there, what I saw as I visited and traveled throughout the continent of Africa with respect to what was going on when those who did not have what they basically needed were not provided what I called a horizon of hope. And what my job was as a uniformed soldier was causing my part of this thing called, this triad that I use, this triad of the defense, certainly my lane, development, as well as governance or diplomacy, and how all three needed to be working together to build stability. And so I'll stop there, and hopefully we'll have additional conversation, but again, I could go on, and I just like to say that I'm just going to give my two buddies, the Doctors Jami and Manago, a shout out, because I know what it takes to do something like this. So to you two hot rods, and Madam, I'd like your piece too there, because I did acknowledge, I used to say all protocols observed, but I like them standing on the protocols already put on force, so that's great.
Thank you.
All right.
Gentlemen, the United States tends to look at its foreign policy from two perspectives. How do we defend and secure, and then how do we create jobs and economic opportunity? Colonel Pena, you served Pentagon, Defense Department as Deputy Assistant Secretary, focusing on the Caribbean, Latin America. When we look at what's going on in places like Venezuela, Nicaragua, South America migration, the U.S. seems to be swinging in shadows. What is it that we're missing, if anything? And what could we do better, particularly because it's right in our hemisphere, right in our backyard, sir?
That's an excellent question. I always like to promote the United States because this is the experience that I've lived. When you start from nothing and you go to being able to speak to you, you realize that there's a special model in the United States. I am a firm proponent of the American dream. And the uniqueness of my American dream story is that I'm not unique. Every one of you has an American dream story. So I'd like to talk about the United States from what it is that makes us unique. And that doesn't diminish anybody else's story either. It's just that I feel proud of who I am, and I'm going to talk about who I am and share with you that that dream is possible for anybody who follows it. So one of the things that we need to do is promote what it is that made us the country that we are, because we are acceptant of so many people. When I can sit here before you as I look, and you can, I have a friend of mine that's running for political office in Virginia. His name is Hung Cao. He and I have had the same conversation. He came from Vietnam, I came from Mexico, but we have the same experiences, and we all came here because this is where you can live them out. I think that the United States sets an example for the rest of the world, what it is to be in a democracy, a representative republic, and what it is to promote those values. And when I was in the Army, we always talked about promoting civilian control of the military, human rights, making sure that we treated everybody equally, as General Ward has so eloquently put. These are the kinds of values and traditions that we promote. These are the kinds of things that we shouldn't shy away from. And when you start talking about countries like Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, I dealt with the Nicaraguans. I met Mr. Chavez. He gave me his whole spiel about the Mao. He started quoting Mao to me. So I thought it was kind of interesting. But where did that get Venezuela? I got a phone call for Humberto Ortega. Wanted to know if he wanted to make sure that we knew that he wasn't as bad as his brother. And I'm like, okay, well, that doesn't help anything because you're not in charge. And then you've got Cuba. I came to the United States in 1961 amidst the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, the missile crisis was in 62, but in 61 we had other issues like the Bay of Pigs. So we've gone through some growing pains in that process. But the entire time that all this was going through, I knew that there was a model that represented the United States, and there was a model that didn't work. In 1980, I went into East Germany. And that's when I realized that Ivan was not 10 feet tall and bulletproof. As soon as you went from West Germany to East Germany, that we went from being like this to being like this. Those systems don't work. So we shouldn't be ashamed to talk about the system that does work, and let's see what we can discuss. Let's look at that dialogue that brings us closer together. When I was in Chile, I always talked about these are your interests, these are our interests. Let's see where they meet and they have a confluence. Let's look at which of those you prioritize and which we prioritize. Let's put money toward those, and let's make those eccentric circles more concentric.
Well, as you talk about that, stability is certainly a key factor, and maybe you both can touch on just a little bit. What factors must be present for a country to have a stable national security? I'll come back to you, Colonel Pena, and then General Ward. I'd like for you to touch on that.
Well, I don't want to bogart the state, so I think that what you need to do is you at least have to have an agreement on how you're going to be governed. Let's agree on democracy. Let's agree on representative government. And by representative government democracy, I mean not one vote, one time. What I mean is make sure that you have an election system that protects the minority when they're out of power, so that there's at least some give and take so that you can create some semblance of stability, because when you end up with one-party rule, you end up with Cuba, you end up with Nicaragua, and you end up with Venezuela. So that, just in general terms, I would look at that as one of the key factors.
General Ward?
There are a couple of things that are important for stability to occur in a country, a region. Institutions, because as was pointed out, you have transitions, folks come and go. But if you have institutions that are credible, that are respected, that operate with more integrity rather than less. There's not perfection anywhere. There's one perfect person walk this earth, and we know that's none of us. But there's more integrity than less integrity that work and have as their raison d'etre its people and not themselves. In the United States military, I took an oath to a constitution. The constitution represents the people, not an individual, not a party. And so the things that we did were in support of that constitution and support of our people. And when those are perpetuated, it transcends time, it makes a difference. Secondly, you need, I won't call it a vision, but you need a purpose that says the things that we are doing are things designed to advance the society as opposed to advancing an individual. And when those are in place and they are being able to be implemented or achieved because of a system of representation, so that the least of us feels as if her voice has meaning and value and worth. And it is imperative upon those of us who have something to ensure that those who have less aren't ignored and forgotten. And when you have those in places that have issues or problems, I go back to what I said, that horizon of hope exists. But when you don't have it, when the least of us says, well, it will never be any different than it is today, so I just don't care any longer. And therefore you have things go on that produces instability. Those are the drivers of instability, from food insecurity, to lack of the ability to be self-realized in your health, your education, those aspects of society that causes individuals to feel good about themselves.
You just touched on hope. Colonel Pena, talking about hope, what do you see as a necessary component to assist developing nations help their citizens move from a state of poverty to providing opportunity, jobs, and that security and stability that General Ward referenced?
And I want to use an historical example when we talk about this. For example, people make a lot of hay about Chile, for example. Chile, you've got to remember, 1970 was, they had a change of government. It was democratic in nature, and you had Mr. Salvadorian to take charge. And then you had Mr. Fidel Castro shows up and he hangs around the country for 30 days. No other time can I think of in history where a head of government goes to another place, another country, and hangs around for 30 days. Because they wanted to show that they could come up with this beautiful model of communism that did not work. And sadly, the change of government came about through a coup. And as General Ward has pointed out, nobody's perfect. And Pinochet was not a nice guy. He did a lot of horrible things, and you can argue that what he did was criminal, and he was tried for it. But he changed the model altogether. He changed the economic model to one of a free market, and he brought in experts from Chicago. They changed the economic model, and Chile went from being a very, very poor country to one that became a first world country, but now is in the process of being challenged yet again because the constitution that Pinochet put in place, that nobody before wanted to change even though they had gone through several democratic governments, has now gone to a vote. They drafted a new constitution. The new constitution is not what people thought it would be. And even though you have a socialist president that is now in charge of that change process, he's now having to reconsider because the draft constitution was resoundingly rejected by the Chilean people. So what happens is, if you want to see systems that work, those that promote free markets, those that promote less government, those that promote a strong defense, or a defense that's adequate for each one of the countries. Not everybody has the same needs. The United States has a global mission, and that's just what we've taken on because we're a superpower. So you have to make those kind of adjustments, you have to make those adaptations, and you have to be able to do it by being able to maintain a dialogue with your partner nations, with your neighbors, so that you don't throw things out of whack. So, a good example in this is Chile.
This, and again, we want to.
Hey, Aaron, before you get that one, I got a little quick.
Yeah, please.
You said, what does it take to create this stability in an environment in a country? Sometimes countries need help. I visited years ago, before he passed, probably one of the most meaningful visits I had. I sat there with Nelson Mandela. And as and first of all, I'm so in awe of this man, of what he had experienced, what he had gone through. But he said one thing to me that really resonated. And the point that he made was, now I can't use his exact words, but basically, Africa can do for itself, but with the help of our friends. And so that notion of help with our friends, that applies to all of us. None of us can do all that we want to do by ourselves. Be you on a sports team, you have teammates that support you in doing what you do. And so that analogy for me is what it takes to create stability, because it's not that any of us can do it all, but where there are gaps, where there are some weaknesses, where the things that need to be improved upon, who's there standing by to help, not to dictate, not to direct, but to support. And when that's happening through relationships that exist, through true partnerships, where those who are engaging as equals, even though one may be a bit more resource-wise, but you're engaging as a partner, and when that happens, and the people see that, then you have the occasion to create a more stable environment rather than not. It doesn't happen overnight, it's not easy. But the potential exists, and as long as you're moving in a direction that shows that potential, then you do have that potential for stability.
Thank you, sir, for those comments and remarks. We encourage you, if you have a question that you would like to present to Colonel Pena, General Ward, please bring those questions forward as we begin to conclude this portion of our panel discussion. One of the questions, General Ward, I think this is directed to you from the audience. Will you say in all honesty, sir, that the United States has supported Africa, especially Nigeria, in the fight against terrorism and insurgency, especially providing much-needed weapons and other forms of assistance? What is the U.S. policy on supporting Africa, not for war, but for peace?
Well, there's a saying that goes like this. I'm not a policymaker, I'm an implementer of policy. And since I've been out of even that job now for within 10 years, in all honesty, I can't say what the answer is. What I can say is this. In partnerships, partners listen to one another. They assess what's there, and based on that understanding and clearly what goes on, because in a partnership, partners act in their own, they will act in their own best interest. Nations act in their own best interest. And someone made the point earlier on with respect to these concentric circles. With respect to, we all exist in our bubble, but at some place those bubbles intersect. So where is that space? And if we spend all of our time talking about what's outside of that space, then we probably don't get too far. But if we concentrate on that space that there is some congruence, and we use that to then expand where we go. And so I would go back to some of my time as the testified before Congress in my posture hearing as a combatant commander. And I'd be asked by a member of Congress, well, General, do you have all you need to get the job done? And are you getting the job done? And my point would be, Congress member, I'm getting the job done, but I certainly could always use more. And it's very likely, because there were competing pieces of that, not all pieces that I understood, but I think the important thing is find a place where those concentric circles meet and work your best to cause mutual satisfaction in those areas, and they continue to move forward. And as partners, that's how partners operate. My honest answer is, I don't know. I'm sure that the Nigerians want more than they're getting. Just like the Ukrainians want more than they're getting. Just like the United States wants more than it's getting from one of its partners. So that is how, but if you find the concentric space, you operate as partners, then you can, over time, expand that. And I believe that's where we work.
Another question from the audience, Colonel Pena, I think this might be directed to you, sir. What are U.S. private sector companies doing that is helping developing nations? And part two of that question is, what are they doing that might be causing harm or slowing growth and development?
That's an excellent question. So one of those areas, and I believe the President of Guyana touched on it very succinctly, was petroleum. Petroleum is one of the, it's black gold, it's Texas tea, it's all these other things. I mean, it generates money, but it's a wonderful thing. And so there is development that can come from that. It's how you manage that development, because there has to be rules in the road. One of the concerns that always comes up with petroleum is, how are you protecting the environment? U.S. companies have gotten really good at protecting the environment. Now, if you allow those companies to just run willy-nilly and destroy the environment, you want to see what it looks like when it doesn't, go to Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela, and that thing is now a cesspool of oil because they were so concerned about yanking as much oil out of the ground as possible that they threw the environment out the window. So I go back to this issue about how socialists do business, how we do business. You've got to make sure that you do it as good stewards of nature. Conservation is a thing. It's very important. We've got to make sure that these companies perform in accordance with the same standards in the United States as they do overseas. And I think for the most part, American companies do. But we've got to hold all companies accountable. You know, we're competitors with China. You know, most people say, well, the Chinese are our adversary. In one aspect, yes. But you've got to remember that the number 2 trading partner of the United States, I'm sorry, it's number 3 now, because it kind of goes between Canada, Mexico, and China. So China's in the top 3 trading partners with the United States. You've got to hold them accountable to the same standards as you hold the United States accountable. When we start talking about the global community, you've got to make sure that you hold them accountable to the same rules. And there's such a thing as reciprocity. You've got to make sure that reciprocity is something that plays out. Sometimes we throw that out the window and we forget the impact that has when you don't follow simple rules of diplomacy, such as reciprocity.
I would,
I'd add comfort to that. Our American companies do a great job in the health sector.
what do you mean, sir?
From the standpoint of innovations in health that help folks lead a life that causes them to see health benefits. And it's not just, there's a discussion on the vaccinations, I get that, as far as the allocation of how the vaccine was there. But the additional piece of it is in medicines, in facilities, in processing, and being able to watch and track and understand and see where problem areas are. And those sorts of things, health is there, and it kind of dovetails with agricultural advances, well, food, more nutritional foods. I was a lecturer, but I took a great lesson from a former president of Nigeria in Des Moines, Iowa, about 6 years ago, at the World Food Prize. The Boardwalk Dialogue that talked about food security and how, even in that, the health piece of it helped contribute to greater stability. So the health side of it, and American companies have expertise in both those areas.
I would ask you both now to think about, as we close out this portion of our panel session, to give us some closing thoughts and remarks to reflect on, to take away from here. Colonel Pena, could you?
Yes, I want to follow up on the issue of petroleum. One of the things that keeps coming up is petroleum bad, renewables good. That's all well and good, but at the end of the day, can you run a tractor on electricity? Can you run a combine on electricity? Can you drive that wheat truck, that corn truck, that whatever? Especially in developing countries, that are not at the point where EVs are a possibility, you've got to look at how we manage this whole petroleum issue. And when we start adding issues such as, look at the social scores that you gotta have to be able to use a particular type of energy, I don't think that's wise. Because if you weaken the country internally because they cannot access the resources that they have, as we listen to what was spoken about by the President of Guyana, we're not gonna be in a good place. Our partners are not gonna be in a good place because they're not gonna be able to take advantage of the resources that they have. We have to be good stewards of those resources. Even if you start looking at EVs, you gotta start looking at what's the cost of mining lithium? What's the cost of disposing of some of these batteries? What's the cost to the grid? Look at what's happening in California. You don't have enough power generation to be able to power those cars that you have. By the way, renewables right now they are 3% of the world's energy supply. And we saw what happened in Texas when that's mismanaged. You end up with people freezing to death. So let's be wise about how we go about doing things. Let's look at a realistic approach at how we impose on people, because those of us in uniform have to be concerned about what kind of instability is generated when you don't manage this well. And what we're seeing, for example, out of Ukraine and Russia, if you start taking away capabilities of the countries, for example, Ukraine is the 4th exporter of wheat to the world. Look what impact that has in Africa. All of these things are tied together, and we have to be realistic about how we manage resources. So we've got to be real careful about how we put limitations on some of these companies and their development to produce more oil so that they do not become another security risk down the road.
Well, thanks a lot, and I think I'll take it in a different direction for my final comments. I guess I would not be able to come back again if I didn't say something about peace security operations and their criticality and importance. You look at what goes on around the world, and unfortunately, we're going to need peace security operations for a while, because people aren't perfect. Human beings do things that aren't in the best interest of their countries from time to time, and we know that's the case. The United Nations, we're here in New York, UN security operations, peacekeeping operations going on, several going on the continent of Africa, going on in a couple of other places around the world. Also, the European Union, the African Union, sponsoring peace operations, peace security operations. Some of them are more successful than others. Some of them have been failures. Why is that the case? Well, I guess if I knew the answer to that, I'd go to the UN or wherever, and not every time we did one, it would be perfect. So I don't know the total answer, but I do know a few things that are important to have present when you embark upon a peace security mission. The type of mandate that's present. Those who are employed to do the peacekeeping mission, are they trained? And their training and preparation also implies what has their provided company provided to ensure that they don't go to a country to become predators themselves. I use an analogy from time to time. You go to a country and you see a little kid, a little child, a little boy, a little girl. They see a soldier or a policeman, someone in uniform. Is the propensity for them to run to them and hug them around the legs, or to run away? We ought to try to create the type of, so that sees that soldier, that was as their protector and not their oppressor. Other piece of that is, and for me this is so critically important, how are women involved in security? Women need to be involved in security, and not just doing things that we would say, but implementing the type of policies that are there, the approach that women take. And I say this in a general sense, it's something that over my place, and you heard me say where I've been. So it wasn't just in one location, but the attitude of building it out. A quick example, where I'm watching a woman raise 5 kids because her husband had been killed in bushfighting, and she needed to have a little plot of land so that she could feed her kids, raise enough to maybe sell this, so she could send her kids to school. And over a 5-year period of time, I saw that one little act of helping herself evolve into a core where she had another 33 women involved, all with a little bit of help, a little bit of engineering help that was provided by U.S. Army engineers to help with the irrigation system that could grow an exportable crop that she could sell enough at home to buy clothes for her children, pay to go to school, and have enough to take to the local market and sell, export. And she created a co-op with this. And what she said to me was, said, General, this way I'm sure that my son won't be a terrorist. A vision for the future. And so let's talk about peace security operations. What's the mandate? How are the soldiers being sent, trained so that they can relate to where they are? And what type of involvement is establishing the policy so that it is comprehensive in nature, so that it has, again, more of a chance of being successful as opposed to not. I could do more about that, but I'll stop with those three teams.
Let's give General Ward and Colonel Pena a big hand. Thank you for being here with us this afternoon and again for their service and commitment. Not only to the United States, but globally. Thank you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll ask for our last panelist to please come to the stage. Mr. Van McCormick, Executive Director of the International Economic Alliance. The Honorable Marvel Oaks, the Treasurer of the state of Utah. Mr. Nathan Edwards, former corporate executive. Ladies and gentlemen, we certainly want to be respectful of all of our panelists, and I know you want to talk to the general and the colonel, but they'll be around. I don't think they're leaving quite yet. They'll be here, so let's pay due respect to the persons that are here on the stage with us now.
Well, I don't think it's fair to have us follow generals. I mean, were they good or what? I think generals got to do radio for a living. His voice was great. Wow.
I want to follow the lead that we have all afternoon. I can go into personal bios and read them off, and it'll somewhat capture the experience and the work, current and past, future ideas of all the gentlemen here on the stage with us now. But what I'd rather do is just take a few minutes before we go into our Q&A portion of our discussion, and have each one of you just tell us a little bit about your background, not that I would know, but that the folks that are here with us this afternoon might know. So from a protocol standpoint, we would start with Treasurer. Would you please lead us?
Thank you. Yeah, it's an honor to be here. My name is Marlo Oaks. I'm the treasurer for the state of Utah. I spent most of my career in institutional investment management and investment banking, and appreciated the comments from Colonel Pena talking about Chile and free markets. Human prosperity, that we talked a little bit about here, really requires two basic industries, energy and agriculture. And in terms of energy, you need consistent, cheap, reliable energy. That is a foundational industry in any country in order to prosper. And if you think about markets, markets require different views about the future. So in graduate school, I had a professor who wrote a very famous paper on orange juice futures markets and meteorologists. And who is better at predicting the weather? And if you think about the meteorologists, we're talking about the experts, we're talking about the scientists, the people that should know and should be able to predict the weather better than anybody. But guess what? The markets are better at predicting weather. And that should tell us something very important. We should be very skeptical about scientists or experts who are trying to push an agenda onto us, because markets have tremendous information embedded in them. So the only way that markets work is to have alternative viewpoints about the future. So one of the best ways to destroy a market is to converge everyone onto the same view and convince people of an imminent crisis. One of the biggest ones we hear about today is that we must all stop using fossil fuel or we will all die. The climate is an existential threat. Now, I'm not a scientist. I don't necessarily take a view on that. But I can tell you that when we talk about a crisis, we need to be very careful. James Madison said, "Crisis is the rallying cry of the tyrant." If you can get people to all believe that we are in an existential threat, then you can get them to do things that maybe are not in their best interests. So Sri Lanka is an excellent example. Sri Lanka was told by the experts that they needed to get away from traditional nitrogen fertilizer. And what happened? You saw, essentially, you had people that were starving. You reduced the food supply, and food security went down. And fossil fuel prices were high. And you saw the overthrow of the government, civil unrest, as a result of outside experts telling Sri Lanka what kind of policies they need to implement. Now, if you go back to think about markets, who has the incentive in the marketplace? Is it the expert that is going to be harmed by giving you bad advice? Or is it the one who actually has money in the marketplace that has something on the line that will lose if they are wrong? Be very careful about incentives. So I'll leave it with that.
Thank you. Mr. McCormick, and then we'll come to Ms. Nash.
Well, I think that's a phenomenal view, and I wanted to introduce myself actually as President Ali. Was that guy good? That gave me a perspective that was saying what you're saying, but from the market, from the man running a country who himself is not a right-wing Trump Republican, right? So I thought that was absolutely fascinating the way you put diverse views together. And that's kind of what we do with the International Economic Alliance, is we try to be a platform to bring together voices from the left and the right, because what we found over the years is there's a tremendous disconnect from people who understand what the free market is and those who are central planning. There were two economists that really summarized this. One was Hayek, who was the Austrian side of things, who believed in the free markets, and the other one was John Maynard Keynes, which is more central planning. And so really that battle for the world economy, there was a great documentary many years ago by Joe Stanislaw that documented the difference between these two. And I think many of us here thought that, with Gorbachev wisely ending the Soviet Union, that we might see the end of communism, but we're not. And so that view of central planning is still out there, as if we just did it in a better way. And so what we try to do is to work across all those lines to defend capitalism the American way, because we believe that will help rise. Rising tide lifts all boats is the belief. And so I think you all have done a wonderful job today highlighting the opportunities in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean as far as aligning the economic incentives. And it'll be very interesting to see how Guyana, am I saying it the proper way this time? For those of you who weren't here this morning, I guess, Ghana and Guyana in the wrong way. So, but no, I think well done and very impressive what you said, and look forward to talking more about how ESG impacts what work you're doing.
Mr.
Thank you, Aaron. And thanks again to all the organizers and all of you who have participated today and attended. My name is Nathan Estruth, husband to Madonna of 30 years. We have 4 adult kids, and I spent 27 years as an executive at Procter & Gamble. working in, around the world, but located in both the U.S. and in China for a number of years. I had the privilege to run their corporate new business department, which meant I worked across all their divisions globally as we look to build business and create opportunities. As part of my time at P&G, I observed what now the rest of the world and all of us have heard now as woke capitalism or woke corporations. And I saw it happening not only in P&G but in all of the other larger companies that I would interact with. And I would say that the role of multinational corporations has changed dramatically in the last 10 years, but especially in the last 3. And Dr. Giammi, at the beginning of the morning, said, more unites us than divides us. And it used to be that corporations and business was one of those things that could unite us because it was in everyone's interest, right, to work together. Rising tide lifts all boats, economic development, jobs, trade. Unfortunately, in the era of stakeholder capitalism, I suggest to you that stakeholder capitalism divides us. And it has moved business from being a uniter to a divider. And that is something that we have to take very seriously and understand as individuals, as citizens, as employees, and as nations. Especially when you think about the high number of large multinational corporations that from a dollar standpoint, right, are much larger than many nations around the world. And so when stakeholder capitalism redefines stakeholders from employees and the communities and countries in which corporations work to actual interest groups that are defined by social media mobs and anyone else, right? It has radically changed the nature of business. And this is a real threat that can divide us. And so I appreciate the fact that we're integrating these thoughts today between government and corporations and diplomacy and military, because they all are related, and corporations have become, in many ways, a legitimate threat to the sovereignty of nations as they bring almost a cultural colonialism to the table as they now go to market.
Thank you. I want to come back to you, Mr. McCormick, and I want you to help us kind of set the stage for the flavor of our discussion panel. You were with IEA at the very start of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Now it's morphed into maybe ESG and these other things. From where it started and its original stated purpose to where it is now, has it stayed on track? Can you provide us with a picture or historical overview, having been there from the very beginning? Can you share that with us, please?
Sure. Well, I think one is one of the things that we've heard from a lot of the people today is the aligning of interests. And the one thing that I would say that I noticed working with a lot of the folks 20 years ago over that what were first the Millennium Development Goals back in the year 2000. Those were the Millennium Development Goals. Then there was a 5th anniversary that came up in 2005. I'm pretty good with math. Not the treasurer, but I'm pretty good with math. And in 2005, and those were the sustainable. So they were trying to say, hey, how are we going to take the Millennium Development Goals and then sustain them? And what I noticed is their intent was in the right place. Everybody that I dealt with, they had the right intent. And then as they tried to implement the sustainable goals, then of course social corporate responsibility became the buzzword, which in a way is kind of an insult to corporations, but it certainly created a center within these corporations to address these issues, which then sadly went from having the right intentions, in my perspective, to really creeping into partisan. Instead of it truly just looking at how to create more jobs, how to build economies, have discussions on which policy might be right, it really became a vehicle to implement the policies of people that saw things in a more central planning way, which is kind of sad, because I think the debate to find the best way to do things is usually the best way. One of the things they teach at Harvard Business School is, you want to take two teams and you want to have each team argue the other's viewpoint, right? And so that dialogue is certainly needed right now. And so I'm glad that you're creating a forum where people can share different perspectives. And so it's evolved from the issue of Millennium Development Goals, rid the world of poverty, hunger, and many of the other great causes, to things that I would say were more virtue and vice-based, less science-based, less economic-based, and more partisan politics. So I think that's kind of sad, as it's gotten away from its original good intentions. And I hope that the discussions that are happening around the world on all these issues will give a voice to those people who see things in a more free market way.
Thank you, McCormick. Treasurer Oaks, new environmental, social, government policies have made a profound impact on how states, banking and financial institutions conduct their day-to-day business, both domestically and globally, based on the conversations that we've had just this afternoon and this morning. How have these new policies and required standards altered the way the state of Utah conducts its business? And for those of you that may not know, Utah is a critical state from a financial standpoint from the United States. When we talk about credit cards and finance and banking, Utah is right there with New York, Delaware, Utah is right there. So, Treasurer, can you talk a little about that? How these new environmental, social, governmental policies intertwine has maybe interrupted business in Utah?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think, and to piggyback off of the socially responsible comments, if you think about where socially responsible investment has gone, that was really the idea that if I have certain values that I want to implement in a portfolio, I may not want exposure to a certain industry, then I'll avoid investing in that particular industry. And then ESG really came along, and I think hijacked that, because if you respect the markets and you respect other people and allow them to have a different view than your own, then socially responsible investing is not going to accomplish an agenda. Because in free market capitalism, if one bank decides not to bank a fossil fuel company, and then another bank will step in and provide that business. The only way to implement an agenda is to drive to one viewpoint. And so ESG became much more aggressive and has captured a significant amount of the financial services industry. And the reason for that is that's the only way you can drive an agenda, is to keep capital from moving into a particular industry, and case in point is fossil fuel. So globally, there's been, back in 2015, about $50 billion was raised globally from institutional investors for oil and gas projects. That's 2015. In 2021, that number was $5 billion, a drop of over 90%. The only way that happens is through coercion of capital, to keep capital from moving into projects that otherwise it would go into.
Coercion by whom, sir, and to?
Yes, so this is a global agenda being pushed largely by Europe and globalist interests that are using the climate as a crisis to drive to one outcome, to prevent capital from moving where it otherwise would go. And we see the impact in terms of instability in places like Sri Lanka. And in fact, inflation in the United States is partly a function of supply, of oil supply. Now, gasoline prices have come down this summer because of the Permian Basin and because of the strategic oil reserves, oil being let out of those. There's a lot more oil coming out of the Permian Basin in Texas, and then strategic oil reserves have been released to the marketplace, and so that's brought the price of oil down. But we are in a serious problem if we continue to underinvest in oil and gas in this country and globally, because it has been one of the foundational elements leading to inflation. So getting back to the ESG, ESG uses economic force to drive a political agenda, and that's where it impacts the sovereignty of states or nations, because it is then the capital providers that are demanding compliance to an agenda that may not be in the best interest of any particular entity, and certainly takes away the ability of that entity to determine their own fate.
Are we seeing that as an example of that? It might be California, where you have several states now fighting California because their legislatures signed on to an agreement that said, look, by 2035, 2036, they will do away with all gasoline vehicles and can only manufacture, produce, sell electric vehicles. And I think Utah is one of the states that's involved in that pushback.
Yes, absolutely.
Against that.
Yeah, well, and even maybe more immediate is California has said we are not going to pay for state employees to travel to states that have the wrong policies. Where is this going?
I don't understand that. What does that mean, sir?
So in other words, state employees of California, if they decide to travel to Utah, the state of California will not pay for that travel because Utah has the wrong politics.
What happens to the ski areas in Utah? I mean, I think you got more force there, supply, demand. You have the mountains.
We're calling the Texans to come up.
They call the Texans, okay. Californians are big skiers for everybody. They love Utah.
I guess I'll just have to stay in California.
It's a great ski area.
That's very interesting. I want to move on. Today, more than ever, there is an interconnectivity, and General Ward talked about that, some of the prime ministers talked about that, between nation states and private sector. We see this being orchestrated via public-private partnerships and other structures that are being put together to meet those ends. During your time at Procter & Gamble, and even as your time as a private businessman, when did you see this taking shape? And looking back, how would you describe the results of those practices today? What is it that we see now before us?
Yeah, well, absolutely, right? The partnership between business and governments is critical, right? For business to be done, for jobs to be created, for economic development. I saw it personally, when I was living and working in China. There was a reference earlier this morning to a congressional delegation of staffers that got to go into China during a particularly sticky time. My wife and I were living in China at that time. And so those open doors of communication between governments and between business and governments is absolutely essential for a free flow of capital and people and goods. And I think by and large, most of the interaction that I witnessed 20 years ago was around economic development, taxes, regulation. How do you make sure that you are a good citizen as a corporation in a country and abiding by those laws, and talking about what's reasonable and what's not, and how you can actually develop and, back to stakeholders, actually grow the community or the country in which you work. With the advent of stakeholder capitalism and ESG, I think this is changing. And I've witnessed, even in the last couple of years with the global supply chain crisis following after the pandemic, right? People are realizing that when governments and business are hostile to one another because governments might actually not appreciate a different agenda than a business brings, or may not appreciate the government in which the business is domiciled. You have major crises because we're so interconnected globally, right? And so I think both on the geopolitics and the strategy of government to government, it remains essential for those global supply lanes to stay open. But also on the protection of sovereignty for governments. Business needs to do business. They need to make money for their shareholders and do good for the communities in which they live and work. And when they bring a social and an environmental agenda, first and foremost, and raise stakeholders or causes above business for their shareholders, you all of a sudden can run into huge antagonisms with governments. And I think we're seeing that now, honestly, around the world, because many multinationals based in the US or in Western Europe are choosing to try and push those, what I would call extreme cultural values. Quoting President Ali there on the word extreme, divides us. They're dividing us and causing issues in these relationships with governments.
Yeah. And speaking of that, following up on something that President Ali said, and then the foreign minister of Zambia, who was here in his comments, and they both alluded to that the U.S. is beginning to tie much of its foreign aid to developing nations and them adopting these new social, cultural policies that they may not necessarily agree with. And now you even see some corporations doing the same. I'd like for you to follow back up on that, and then Mr. McCormick, I'd like for you to touch on that from your lens, working with IEA on these kind of things.
This is a very dangerous moment when we see this, what I would call partnership or collusion between large corporations and government aid tied to ESG and promoting values to change and try and change the laws and undermine the values of other countries.
Right.
And that's a very dangerous place. President Ali said extremes, right? They result in disparities and more inequality, right? And they divide us. And that is the moment that we're at. And I think what it requires is forums just like this, partnerships like this, where actually nations can stand together with citizens and employees, right, and nonprofits to push back on corporations and remind them that they actually do have a real job to drive business, drive economic development, and ask those tough questions. Right? That's not a position that actually governments have often been in. But are you going to try and undermine the values of our citizens who come to work for you? We haven't had to ask those questions before very much. Now it's almost needs to be price of entry. And we talked earlier about how a number of African nations stood together against some policies that the World Health Organization tried to bring in June. I think that's a great example of what actually could be done to basically help corporations tack back towards neutral and actually focus again on business and shareholders for economic development. But it is going to take a coalition of nations to do that.
Mr. McCormick?
No, I think those are great points in building on that. I think it goes back to what the heads of states earlier today said, what the military leaders said as far as where we're overlapping. Right, in the environment, simply put, it's about timing and transition. I don't know anybody here, I grew up in West Texas, I don't know anybody that doesn't wish hydrogen would work. I remember 20 years ago when hydrogen was only 10 years away. So, when that happens, when the transition timing is right, I think everybody would be fine with it. I think it's the way it's being enforced without a clear plan on what that timing and transition is, so that we don't cause more hardship, right? And on the S, in many cases, culturally, we might have to have cultural sensitivity to people's religious beliefs, people's cultural beliefs, and a lot of the issues there, and across countries. And then on the G, on the governance, Primarily, that's about trying to reduce corruption, which I think we all have a lot of overlap in. So if you break them down, there's more that we have in common, but that's going to take dialogue. And right now, there's a momentum of no dialogue, which I feel there's a little bit of a pushback on, so that we can find the common ground to make those transitions to positive things work, to make mutual respect of people's values also work. So I would just have a more inclusive view, if I can co-opt the term that is used in very Morpheus ways. But I would say to include all the dialogue across the spectrum and be uniters, not dividers, to quote another former U.S. president.
Treasurer, I forget which one of the other speakers today said that many of the, I think it was Mr. Sheeblake and his panel, the Washington diplomat, talked about how many sovereign heads or ambassadors actually now travel to the States to conduct business in economic development. And that had started to become a tool to win friends and influence people. But because some of them are talking about the social coercion aspect of things, they're starting now to rebuff going into the States, working with the U.S., which is leaving openings now for, I think, when the Prime Minister talked about China, others coming over, stepping into the gap where the U.S. might be stepping back and not leading from the front. How do you view this from the state of Utah and how this is happening in Utah?
Well, I think that really gets to this idea of converging around one narrative, allowing only one future view of the world as kind of acceptable. When we, so the state of, one of the rating agencies started rating states on ESG metrics, and I saw that as a serious problem, because as soon as you create an additional metric, then the market can look at that metric and decide, well, this state shouldn't be allowed to borrow at the most inexpensive rates, or the rate that they normally would borrow at because of some political support. ESG is essentially putting politics into the capital markets. It's taking policy that could not pass a legislative process and using the capital markets to drive that particular agenda.
Who is that punishing, sir? Or who is it aiding?
It is absolutely putting into place a framework to force behavior, to punish states, to punish any entity that is accessing the capital markets. If you do not have the right policies, if you do not have the right compliance to the agenda, then you will pay a price financially. And so it is very dangerous going down this path, and it's this politicization of everything that is creating this division amongst ourselves, amongst the international community, that I think is the number one concern, that should be the number one concern of all of us, that we need to respect other people's viewpoints and accept the fact that the future is not one agreed upon outcome. And there are different ways of doing things. One of my favorite marketing campaigns of all time was Apple. When they, in the mid-90s, they would show a picture of an innovator, for example, Albert Einstein, and there were two words: think different. If we care about finding solutions, if we care about innovation, if we care about the future progress of humanity, we will allow each other to think different and come up with the best solutions.
Thank you. I'm going to ask each of you now to think about your closing thoughts, things for us to take away, reflect upon, and re-engage with one another. We'll start with Mr. Moore.
Well, I would, in closing, I would like to thank you and the other partners in pulling all this together. Job well done. I would have to be repetitive and go back to inclusion of dialogue, talking about these key issues, understanding the E, the S, and the G, and the different components and what that means. And once again, finding the common link on those from environment. Maybe we have to agree to disagree on some of the social stands and on governance. I think who doesn't agree on trying to reduce corruption around the world and create more jobs through commerce and all the other things that we've spread in the American. So speaking as an American, I'm optimistic of the future of our country. I'm optimistic of the way we engage around the world, and it was great to hear from a lot of the leaders today what we can do better as a country to help them. So I would say to continue this dialogue and appreciate you setting this all up and including us. And it was great to hear from different perspectives, the corporate and the investor world of including that voice. So I'd say inclusivity, timing, and transition.
And again, observing protocol, Mr. Harris, we're going to ask you to give us your
In August of 2019, over 200 CEOs of large corporations signed a document. They were called from the Business Roundtable, and the document was, and I quote, redefines the purpose of a corporation, unquote. I would ask you today, have corporations become more uniters or dividers since those CEOs signed that document 3 years ago? I believe they have become more dividers, and I believe that it absolutely requires us in unity as nations and citizens and employees around the world to find ways to help them actually understand the negative implications to national sovereignty, to family values, to employees' values and free speech and freedom of conscience, and help them tack back to the importance of shareholder primacy and the original meaning of stakeholders, that is, employees in the communities and countries in which they operate.
Thank you. So it's an honor to be here, as I said. I appreciate this dialogue, and I would just end with the thought related to markets, and as we think about implementing policies that are being promoted by experts, when we're addressing a long-term crisis like climate, we need to take into account what are the short-term implications or what are the costs associated with the policies that we are implementing to address a problem. In the name of long-term benefit of humanity, we have created tremendous short-term problems in the name, by way of inflation. The people who can least afford this climate change, or those who are suffering the most from this agenda, are those who can least afford it in the form of inflation. And so inflation is very expensive, as is food instability in the case of Sri Lanka. How well thought out was that policy to take away traditional fertilizer, right, to address a long-term crisis? We're creating short-term crises that are even more, potentially more impactful. So we have got to think about what are the implications of what we do, and be very careful with those who claim to be experts, because at the end of the day, it's people who have things on the line, whether it's money or their livelihoods, whatever it is, that will come up with better solutions than the experts. So, thank you.
Let's thank Mr. McCormick, Treasurer Nathan, for being with us this afternoon. Let's give them a round of applause for sharing. We don't want a hot mic situation.
Tell Vlad, I'll talk to him later.
We have one more presentation this afternoon to close us out. And you know how they talk about saving the best for last. It's certainly we've saved one of the best parts of our program for the end of our program to close us out. And we have Mr. Tom Bevan. Is Tom? Yeah, we have Mr. Tom Bevan, who is the co-founder of Real Clear Politics. Now, let's give this to those of you who may not be political insiders and follow this stuff like the Holy Grail. Real Clear Politics is absolutely the Holy Grail, and we are headed into a very, very tenuous time going into this 2022 midterm election. And Mr. Bevan is going to talk with us about the analysis of the 2022 midterm election, what that could pose to mean both domestically here in the United States and globally. So let's please bring to the podium with a round of applause Mr. Tom Bevan, the co-founder of Real Clear Politics.